This is Modern Mindset, the show that picks the brains of the world's leading minds to help you unlock yours. I'm your host, Adam Cox, and joining me today we have Camilla Smith, who is the clinical director of Become. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really
Great.
grateful to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on the show, Camilla. So I guess, first of all, quick introduction for you. Give us a bit of an insight in terms of who you are and what you do.
Yes, so I'm a therapist by trade, and more currently, I'm also the chief clinical officer at Become. We're a nutraceutical company, but more than that, we are utilizing a three-prong approach, which includes nutrition, supplementation, and consultation, to help alleviate anxiety. And quick kind of background to my story is when I started working as a therapist, I love what I do, but quickly realized that there was a lot that I didn't understand. I felt underprepared for. I didn't feel that even the trainings that were available from a clinical perspective were helping me understand at a deeper core. And I became, through my own experiences of having experienced anxiety myself, became very interested in the science of anxiety and trying to learn more about that bridge between our mental health, our gut health, and kind of the physical science part of anxiety. So I went back to school, got my doctorate in health sciences, and since then learned so much more, which all culminated in me researching natural alternatives for anxiety. And fast forward, to recently launching a supplement that's based on all of my research and experiences. So it's been an exciting ride.
And I think one of the misconceptions, or at least perceptions, that people have about anxiety is that it's somehow an irrational response. That the kind of it's all in the head, it's all in the mind. It has nothing to do with this kind of holistic approach of what's happening in the body and everything else. And I think particularly in the UK, there was a perception that if you're feeling anxious, somehow there's something wrong with you. You're broken in some way. Obviously, you're in the industry too. What are some of the perceptions or misconceptions that you've noticed that people have about anxiety?
Yeah, well, I mean, to kind of validate what you said, the fact that it's in our thoughts, that we can stop it, that it is self-induced or attention seeking, right? I've heard that a lot when people will say like, oh, that person's just doing it for attention. So the misperception is that anxiety, and that it's also a state of disease, right? So that mental health and we have what we call organic disorders, right? So for example, ADHD, the autism spectrum, yeah, these are all the way that the brain, schizophrenia, right? So it's no different than someone that is born with a genetic mutation, yet we seem to view it as separate from the body. So I think there's a big misunderstanding in terms of the science and the physiology of anxiety. But most of all, I would say that the most damaging and the most painful, misperception is that it is a lack of willpower, and that if we just try hard enough, right, we can kind of will our way out of our feelings or our experiences.
I would echo that sentiment, and there is a feeling of shame or guilt linked to anxiety because of this perception that somehow it's a choice. But no one in their right mind would choose to feel anxiety. And I mean, there's some kind of yogi masters that can kind of change their heart rate and things like that. But the average person doesn't change, their physiological responses. They don't make their heart beat to 200 beats per minute voluntarily. This is a physiological kind of response. So why do you think there is such a stigma and a perception that somehow we're flawed humans if we experience anxiety?
I mean, I think in general that the field of psychology has been evolving, and it hasn't been all that long, right, since we had a big wave and a big movement of discovery. The human mind has always been, obviously present with us, but we're just starting to kind of understand the processes. So if we think back to, I mean, this was maybe 40 decades or so, not even. Yeah, not 40 decades, 4 decades, that would be a long time. um, so we think back to this, and at that time it was believed that any state that wasn't optimal was a state of disease, right? That there was something wrong. And we think back to really barbaric practices like lobotomies, right? People would have all of these really cruel treatments. So considering the evolution of psychology, right, I think we're actually making great progress. But I think it really stems from really early on theories and philosophies about the mind that we've had to slowly come away from, kind of like medicine, right? So in medicine, we've had a more formalized state of, kind of medicine itself, we are just starting with mental health, right? We've had a little bit of a later start than more kind of with the physical aspect. So I think timing also has something to do with it.
Yeah, there certainly has been. And I think, to a large extent, if you think of the 18th, 19th centuries, a lot of the key health developments, the key progress came from the medical model, where if they looked at hygiene or if they looked at pharmaceuticals and they saw an improvement, then actually for a lot of conditions, let's say, internal organs and things like that, medicine really helped. And I think that steered the way for actually this medical model to be applied on issues of the mind when it wasn't always necessarily the right kind of approach. And I think we've seen that recently with the long-standing study on depression being a chemical imbalance, being largely discredited now, and starting to look at these things in more holistic approach of lifestyle, diet, all these various kind of factors. What elements of the health or the medical model do you think are really useful when it comes to looking at anxiety, would you say?
So we have a system, and the name of it is, well, the short is the HPA axis. And the HPA axis is what basically connects our brain down our central nervous system and sends out all of the messages when we are in a state of stress or panic, trauma, we're responding. Understanding that that system is a scientific physiological system, right? So it starts all the way at the top with the hypothalamus. We sense danger, right? And then it sends a signal to our adrenal glands. Our adrenal glands then release a lot of different endorphins, adrenaline, so to speak, epinephrine, norepinephrine releases all of that. And then what happens, at the end of that whole cascade is that we feel anxiety. But we have to go through all of that, right? Our brain is involved, our adrenal glands are involved, our heart is involved. So understanding that we have a system in our body and that the end result is anxiety. It's not the beginning, right? A lot of times we think that we are inducing anxiety. No, it's actually no different than, any other physiological process. So I think starting to look at anxiety from the way that it kind of works in the body can be really helpful in understanding from the medical perspective.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. The analogy I use is that if you imagine almost like a row of dominoes, and I think as a child we all played that game where you kind of click them all in a row. Well, the destination is anxiety, but a series of events had to take place in order to arrive at anxiety. And I think although there is a lot more openness out of discussion about mental health, one of the downsides that I've seen is that people take these kind of destinations and start almost labeling them at the identity level. So they say, I have anxiety or I have depression, rather than looking at it as a destination. And I think to some extent it's good that we're having conversations about mental health, but that can be quite disempowering if people just assume that they have anxiety and they're going to have anxiety for their entire life, rather than thinking, what's the actual ingredients that are going on to produce that kind of anxious response. And when you've looked at that, what's some of the approaches that you found particularly useful to help, let's say, kind of reroute the pathway so it doesn't necessarily end at, anxiety as a destination?
So because anxiety, we're looking at anxiety as a purely physiological, right? And whether it is kind of triggered or offset by a thought or an actual event, but what happens, that cascade of dominoes is physical. And the parts that are involved is the central nervous system gets activated. And part of our central nervous system, we have the autonomic, right? So that they are basically, we're either in parasympathetic or in sympathetic drive when we're kind of anxious. There are certain techniques that we can do that automatically re-regulate the central nervous system. And I think those are awesome, they're really great ways. So an example would be at the roof of our mouth, there is the start of the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is really important in regulation, and it goes all the way down to our pelvic area. So if we're feeling anxious, if I apply pressure to the top of the roof of my mouth, it could be with my tongue, just literally push up. Or if you have access to ice, that's even better. You get an ice cube and just kind of place it right at the roof. Automatically, that's going to start kind of jumpstart that relaxation and that re-regulation process. Another one would be on the side of our cheek, we have the most receptors for the parasympathetic system, which calms us. So if I just lightly, really lightly caress the side of my cheek, it automatically activates the system that's gonna, calm us. And there's tons of different skills that we could do that basically what they do is they jumpstart the other systems that helps us to regulate anxiety.
Mm. Yeah, and there's so many different kind of models to it, but I mean, in essence, from a therapeutic point of view, a lot of the approaches tend to be looking at the evaluation element. So, if you evaluate that your life is, or if it feels like your life is in danger, then, having that kind of anxiety response is completely, rational. If you give it a different meaning, it takes on a whole different connotation. Or it's the element of at the point where things are being processed, you kind of interrupt that system. So that might be tapping, or it might be, the kind of the eyes moving from left to right, or whatever it might be. But effectively short circuiting that kind of automatic approach, so the toothpaste doesn't quite leave the tube, and and therefore you can
Yeah.
kind of deal with it. You have a different approach. Obviously, you mentioned that you have this kind of therapeutic psychological approach, but also nutraceutical. So you kind of look at the diet as well. How do they work in harmony to kind of affect our emotional states?
Yeah. So what's interesting before I answer that question, and I love talking about this, is the second brain, right? So we have what's been coined the second brain. And essentially it's in our gut, we have a whole central nervous system that's independent of the one with our brain and spine. And this system is called the enteric nervous system. What it means is that our gut area, our stomach, isn't just there, to break down nutrients, but it actually feels, it senses, it feels, and it reacts to our environment, much like our brain does. The difference between the two is our brain thinks, right, and our gut feels. So, I mean, I've never felt anxiety in my head, like literally. I have felt it in my stomach. If you've ever been driving and you have to hit your brakes really quickly, right? I've literally have felt like a rush straight down to my stomach or even down to my feet.
Mm.
So understanding that there's a connection between our brain, let's say, and our gut, right? And that there's that access that goes back and forth is really important, because however our gut health is, so if I am eating foods that are inflammatory, that are causing me high in toxins, what's going to happen is that that communication center that also feels, that works with my brain, is going to not function as well as it should. So nutrition really goes in, and it doesn't, it has several things. One, nutrition gives us all of the vitamins that we need in order to produce serotonin, which is our mood, food, sleep, and pain neurotransmitter. So what this means is that we need magnesium, we need B6, we need folate, we need a whole lot of different nutrients, and even to create, the chemical that we need to feel good. So one, it gives us the nutrients that we need. Two, if we can reduce inflammation in the gut, right, then we can also effectively reduce inflammation in the brain. Something that I don't think is often talked about, I'm not sure if you have heard, but I've definitely read about leaky gut, right? And
Yep.
What we know is that our stomach has this lining, right? And that foods, inflammation kind of goes in, it destroys the lining. What I think we don't talk about enough is that our brain has the same thing. It's called the BBB, the blood-brain barrier. And it's the same thing. So we can actually have a leaky brain, I guess, if we want to use that terminology, which means that all of the, the toxins that we're eating, all of the food, and maybe it's inflammatory food, can actually go up into our brain and also cause the same thing as in our gut. And part of what we've added to this mix, it's a mix of amino acids, vitamin, probiotic, and a botanical. So we really try to think about the different facets and what we need. And one of the things that's included in it is a probiotic, right? So probiotic is this healthy bacteria. There's actually been recent studies that have found bacteria in actual brain tissue. So this bacteria in our gut can travel all the way up into our brain and colonize in our brain. So it's so important. The probiotics kind of go in and they help to clean out the gut, but also keep the brain nice and healthy from any bacteria, any toxins, and help repair. So this is where nutrition can really help us to decrease inflammation, increase and synthesize the chemicals so that we can produce the chemicals that we need, and then also help to kind of balance everything out and keep like a healthy environment.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good way of thinking about it. That if the gut is that kind of element of intuitive feedback loop, so it's kind of like able to process so much more information and kind of give you signals, then an unhealthy gut is going to be not as effective at communicating as a healthy gut. And equally, having that kind of key ingredients to have the right neurotransmitters for feeling good is a nice kind of recipe. And yet the traditional model of thinking about mental health would look very much towards, let's say, pharmacological approaches, so the psychiatric model, or perhaps the psychological model in terms of counseling and therapy and things like that. Why do you think there isn't more focus on the overall holistic approach? So looking at diet, looking at sleep, looking at lifestyle kind of issues, and evaluating everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting to the point where it requires a lot of integration, right? So we're having to pull from the field of nutrition. We're having to pull from the field of nutritional psychology, from medicine, from cognitive, from just psychological within itself. So all of these are coming together and we haven't reached a place where we've formally integrated all of these different sources. I think we're making a lot of discovery in terms of learning more about these systems that have been in our body. But I think right now we're in a process, and this is really where I felt really strongly that I needed to become the person that I couldn't find. And what I mean by that is when I was working with my clients, I would get referrals from their primary care doctor. And sometimes there would be actual medical things that I had no idea how those medical things affected mental health. And the only other doctor that and I am not against, pharmaceuticals. I think that, it's a spectrum, right? And people benefit from different things. But the only doctor that I could really speak to was a psychiatrist. And I wasn't able to really find that person in the middle that could have a good working knowledge of the science, right? And provide a kind of like a neutral, educative approach. So my guess on this is that we're getting there slowly. We're actually, I think, just kind of starting to like piece it together, right? We're like, oh wow, yeah, that works with this and this works with that. So it's going to take some time before I think we kind of incorporate it into maybe training programs, right? That's another area that I think is really important, is that when clinicians are getting trained, that this is being included in the curriculum and coursework. So hopefully with time, we'll start, integrating more.
Yeah, it's definitely moving in that way, and it's kind of evolving in that way. But I think there is still, for those people that are trained as doctors going through this, when they look at mental health, the first thing they look through is the lens of what prescription, what drug can I prescribe for this? So if someone goes to a doctor with anxiety, instinctively they're trying to write a prescription for beta blockers to try and tackle it at the kind of the brain signal to the physiological response. Whereas, the average doctor is not thinking, what's the first 3 or 4 dominoes of that sequence? They're thinking of the final 2 or 3 dominoes that actually leads to the physiological response. In terms of your experience looking at it from the nutrition perspective, what impact do you feel beta blockers have on the body? Do you think they're like a useful tool in the mix, or are they quite unhelpful in the overall way of looking at anxiety?
I definitely think they're helpful. When we think about anxiety, there's 12 different subsets of anxiety. Some anxiety, so we have general, we have panic, we have phobia, but there's anxiety secondary to medical conditions, right? So what this means is that some people may have another medical condition. Let's say maybe it's a cardiac, thing. And what ends up happening is that the body reacts and then there's anxiety, right? So sometimes a medical condition sometimes it can mimic anxiety, but sometimes it can offset a stress response. Because let's say if my heart, is irregular, just naturally I have an arrhythmia, and out of nowhere my heart starts racing because it's natural, right? But we humans have the ability to make sense of it. So now I might say, oh no, what's wrong? Something's wrong, right? Now I have this anxiety. So beta blockers, I think, are really great when when somebody is managing, perhaps, and not just in that setting, but definitely very good when there's another perhaps medical condition that they would benefit from the beta blockers. So I do think it can be helpful for some. It does have its benefits of relaxation. Some people, take it. It helps with their anxiety and sleep to kind of relax the body. So I think it really depends on the individual and their own unique kind of body chemistry.
But I think at the same time, there's a lot of almost too much confidence that the doctors know what they're talking about and that they've considered all the options and they've arrived at the best option for a client is the beta blockers, and actually they're not considering the gut, they're not considering sleep, they're not considering therapy to look at the original cause of where this anxiety came from, and was there a point that anxiety wasn't there. And I think for that reason it's really important, probably in the area of mental health more than any other area, is that individuals get better awareness and they self-educate, because then they can investigate all the different options themselves rather than just kind of trusting that doctor knows all of these different options and arriving at the right conclusion. Where's a good place for people to start if they're looking to kind of boost their knowledge on mental health or anxiety?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of great resources that are available. And for example, there is the Association of Anxiety. They have a website that has tons of different information. And I think it's important to, when we're looking at sources, to try to find sources that are neutral, right? So maybe it's a university. We might look at resources that are offered through different programs and, kind of start there. I think listening to, even in this conversation that we're having, if we can find, for example, perhaps a podcast or someone that specializes in the field and, kind of really get to know, or, start kind of digging that way and getting more info. So for example, at Become, that is a big part. Our three-prong approach includes the education, the one-on-one consultation, and the supplements, right? We didn't want to just put out a pretty pack of, vitamins and call it a day. We really wanted to provide that. So part of our education approach is 2 weeks ago, I ran a free webinar on the role of nutrition and mental health. We put out content on our social media. We have just, different formats in which we're trying to educate. Also on our website, on the blog, that has really good information. It has really great, info on some of the science and recommendations. So I think finding a reliable source is key. And thankfully, we do have so much available with technology.
Yeah, I think the barriers that would stop people from investigating, let's say, mental health before, because it was a very dry academic kind of area, even just 15, 20 years ago, you had to kind of do a degree or kind of postgraduate qualifications. But things like podcasts and YouTube have kind of opened up this kind of the curtain that has kind of hidden the kind of the information on mental health. And I think also the stigma has changed a lot. It wasn't that long ago that there was a lot of shame attached to any kind of mental health issues, whereas now it's much more pragmatic. It's kind of like, well, I don't like feeling this way. Maybe there's a solution. I think there's much more, a pragmatic approach. What would be your top 3 tips for someone, let's say that they've got ongoing anxiety, they haven't been able to kind of reduce it? Where's a good place for them to start taking an element of ownership to empower the level of anxiety in their life?
Sure. So a couple things, well, 3. The first one is getting to know your anxiety, right? So this is a very intentional journey of understanding and this is more introspective, right? And maybe not so much something that we do in the moment, but what that means is understanding, how do I respond to my anxiety? When I feel anxious, what do I do? Some people become anxious about being anxious. They have anxiety and now they're like, oh no, it's never gonna go away, right? And then it kind of compounds. So it's understanding, what is my personal reaction and relationship with my anxiety? Because right there, that can be a really good place to come in and interject, right? If I tend to be hard on myself when I'm anxious, that at the end, I'm going to be anxious and I'm going to feel down, right? If I'm afraid every time I'm anxious, I'm going to be anxious and afraid. So recognizing what as soon as I feel anxious, what happens next, right? And we can do that through mindfulness. So pausing whenever we're feeling anxiety and really noticing, what am I doing now? Some people might avoid, some people procrastinate, some people go down, a kind of spiral. So number one is there, I think starting with awareness, self-awareness is really key. Two, I keep an actual, like, it's a little box with a bunch of different things. And in there, I have, actually have it here. I keep it right on my desk. So having different options available for you. We know that smell, particularly smell, it's a hijack. So what it does is that when we smell, we activate the prefrontal cortex, deactivate anxiety. So keeping something that smells good accessible, whether it's on your desk, maybe it's, in your car. So preparing to have different tools or options. I would say smell. If you have access to something cold, that's really great. Something that I recommend, they sell these kind of plastic ice cubes, or even the whiskey stones. They're like, the little squares, or that you can put in the freezer. And I would keep those in the freezer. And anytime that we might be feeling anxiety, just holding, right, anything cold. What that does is it brings circulation, it reactivates the circulatory system. So that's going to deactivate it. So having, mindfulness, having tools that are going to work. And then the bigger one is kind of the lifestyle, right? Once we're stabilized, it's looking at what are the areas in my life where I might start, and it's an ongoing process, but where is there a source of my anxiety? Is my anxiety stemming from my relationships? Is my anxiety stemming from medical concerns that I have? Is my anxiety stemming from my stress at work? So understanding which bucket, right? Like, where is it that I'm experiencing the most, and starting in one place. I think if we try to like change everything in our life at once, anyone would be anxious. So we want to make it as, one step at a time, right? The first parts of that domino, and then going little by little.
I think it's also important for anyone listening to this to realize that anxiety is useful in the right context.
Yes.
If as a species, if we didn't have anxiety, that same sympathetic nervous system that activates the adrenaline so quickly would have meant as a species we'd have probably been eaten by predators if we didn't have that ability to quickly have that kind of fight or flight response. And if someone wants to have the goal of being fearless and having no anxiety whatsoever, there's a fine line between fearless and reckless, and you would just end up doing very silly things and probably getting hurt or endangering your life. So anxiety in the right context is actually quite useful, but if it's disproportionate and you're feeling anxious just at the idea of very simple things, probably not that useful, in which case it makes sense to kind of look at different options. In my experience, I've seen two key things that people do to cope with anxiety. The first is avoidance. They just avoid whatever the trigger is. And then the second is self-medication. From your perspective, what coping mechanisms have you seen? And what's the problem with, let's say, using avoidance or self-medication as a coping strategy for anxiety?
Yeah. So you're right. I think avoidance is probably avoidance, procrastination are key. And what ends up happening, with that is, so we're anxious, we avoid, and then now we're anxious about our original, anxiety, but because we become aware of the fact that we've just spent this time avoiding it, so it grows and grows and grows, right? And it just keeps getting bigger. I think our self-talk is one of the areas that there's so much room for potential. And I think sometimes we might try to motivate ourselves to get out of, this state, but by using kind of language or sentiments that at the end of the day put us down, right? So what I mean by that is, let's say that I'm feeling anxious, and then I tell myself, like, come on, just get over it. It's not that big of a deal. You're fine. And we almost gaslight ourselves, right? We tell ourselves, like, you're acting up. You're making this up. It's really not that bad. And what happens is self-invalidation is incredibly, painful. So I think that is one area where we have to be very aware how we talk to ourselves, right? Like, what is the narrative that we have? How are we motivating ourselves? And I think even though it's well-intentioned, right, we might tell ourselves, like, snap out of it. However, kindness and compassion go a really, really long way. So, and we know, research has shown that self-compassion, self-kindness does a lot more than being hard on ourselves.
Yeah, because again, if you're criticizing yourself, there's a presupposition there that you're choosing this anxiety, which is not the case.
Right.
It's the response rather than the actual cause. If someone's listening this right now and they want to learn more about your brand, become or find out other ways in which they can work with you, what's the best place that they can do to reach out?
So our website, it would be a great place to start, and the website is www.joinbecome.co. So I'm going to spell that out. So obviously www.join, become is with a K, so it's BEKOME.co. So .co. We're also on Instagram and TikTok, and our handles on there are Join Become, and again, Become is with a K. And I think that's a great place, to kind of start. Like I said, we really are focused on putting content, educating. We don't want to just, be another supplement that we can buy online and have no connection or understanding. So we do provide a lot of information on the ingredients, the nutrients, and really our goal has been to make nutrition, to make this part one less thing that we have to, stress about, to be worried about, because the internet is a great place, but there's also so many options. There's so much to learn, right? So our goal has been to make nutrition easier to understand, to make supplementation easier to understand. And actually a part of our subscription program, monthly subscription, is that there's a 30-minute personalized consultation. So there's a free 15-minute, anybody that's just curious, has questions, would like to try. There's free 15 minutes that comes with, you don't have to purchase. And then with a subscription is the 30-minute within the first month. And that really helps us to connect and find, what's going to be best suited for people.
Fantastic. Camilla, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
More than welcome. And to you at home, thanks for joining me on Modern Mindset. See you again soon for more.